She was thrown out of her husband's wake before they closed the coffin. Rosario Villanueva was holding a candle in her hand when Bernardo's older sister grabbed her by the arm and pushed her toward the door without saying a word. And no one in the room raised their voice. Welcome to Stories Between Lives. That night, the sky over Michoacán hung dark above the village of Tirapetio, and the smell of copal mingled with the January cold seeping through the cracks of the main gate. Rosario was 34 years old, 3 months pregnant, though it didn't yet show beneath her black shawl, and her hands were cracked from washing other people's clothes for 10 years without anyone ever thanking her. Bernardo Villanueva died on Tuesday at dawn. A heart attack, said those who arrived first. Rosario found him cold in bed when she went to wake him for his morning coffee. She called his name twice. After that, she didn't speak for hours. What no one in the Villanueva family told Rosario was that Bernardo had signed something 2 weeks before he died. The older sister was named Consuelo Villanueva de Paredes, and she had a voice that sounded like cold iron. She arrived that same afternoon with 2 of her sons and a notary Rosario didn't know. She walked into the house without knocking. She opened the drawers of Bernardo's desk with her own key, as though she knew exactly where to look. Rosario was in the kitchen when Consuelo appeared in the doorway with a folder in her hands and said, "This house no longer belongs to you. It never belonged to you. Bernardo put it in the family's name 15 days ago. You have until tomorrow at noon to gather what you brought with you." A neighbor who was present, Doña Esperanza Ruiz, lowered her head and smoothed her apron. She said nothing. Rosario didn't cry. She set the clay jug down slowly on the wood-burning stove and asked if she could at least be at her husband's wake. Consuelo had already turned away. That night, in the room where they had laid Bernardo's coffin, Rosario stood for 2 hours against the back wall, holding the lit candle, looking at the face of a man she had loved in her own way, which had not been perfect, but had been real. When Consuelo placed her hand on her arm and pulled her toward the door, Rosario didn't resist. She walked outside. The candle went out in the cold air. The next morning, with a canvas sack that weighed almost nothing, Rosario Villanueva left Tirapetio in the first truck that stopped on the road. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay. The dirt road heading north in Michoacán is full of curves that don't announce what lies on the other side. Rosario sat by the window for 4 hours, watching the hills, the cypress trees twisted by the north wind, the agaves on the edge of the ravine. The driver was a man of few words who stopped twice without her asking. On the second stop, he offered her a piece of bread without looking at her. Rosario took it. It was her first food of the day. He left her at a crossroads she didn't recognize. He told her that 2 kilometers down the dirt path there was an old estate that belonged to Don Isaías Reyes, a solitary man with few cruelties in him, and that sometimes he let people in who needed a place to stay. He said no more. He went on his way. Rosario walked the 2 kilometers with the sack over her shoulder and her sandals pinching her feet. The air smelled of firewood and recent rain. The path descended between 2 rows of apple trees with their bark gray from winter, and at the end stood the estate, an ochre-colored adobe building with an uneven tile roof and a wooden gate that had once been green. Beside the front door stood a chair with a worn leather seat, and in that chair sat a man of about 70 years old, wearing a palm hat, his hands folded on his knees, watching Rosario approach as if he had been expecting her for a long time. He didn't ask her name. He only said, "There's a room at the end of the hall. It has a roof." Rosario didn't answer. She went inside. What she didn't yet know was that inside that old estate there was something Bernardo Villanueva had left her without ever telling her. The room smelled of damp earth and old wood. It had a narrow bed with a patched brown wool blanket, and in the corner on a small oak box was a framed photograph in dark metal showing a young couple standing in front of that same estate decades earlier. Rosario set the sack on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and placed her hands on her belly. She closed her eyes. She was alone in a way that had no immediate remedy, and for the first time since she had found Bernardo cold in bed, that seemed to her like a fact rather than a tragedy. She breathed deeply. She slept. At dawn, Don Isaías already had the fire lit. Rosario stepped into the hallway with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and he gestured to a bench beside the wood stove without saying anything. There was a clay jug with steaming coffee. They sat down, they ate beans with freshly made tortillas in silence. Outside, you could hear the sound of a large animal moving in the corral. "What's out there?" Rosario asked after a while. "A mare. Her name is Canela. She's old and doesn't work anymore, but she eats well. Do you know what I'm carrying?" Don Isaías looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said no more. Rosario drank her coffee. That's how time began to pass on Don Isaías Reyes's estate. Every morning, the lit fire, the clay pot coffee, the beans or atole, depending on what there was, Don Isaías would go out early to check the boundary and return before noon. Rosario began doing things without anyone asking her, sweeping the corridor, washing the jugs at the basin, shelling corn beside the granary. Canela, the old mare, would come up to the gate each afternoon when Rosario stepped out for air, and Rosario would bring her grass from the yard, a handful each time, and the mare accepted it with that quiet dignity old animals have when they no longer fear anything. On the third day, Rosario found in the granary a half-knitted wool sweater that had belonged to Don Isaías's wife. The needles were still stuck in the exact stitch where the woman had left them 12 years earlier. Rosario pulled them out, cleaned them with a cloth, and that afternoon, sitting in the corridor chair with the evening light falling on the patio, she continued knitting from where the other woman had stopped. Don Isaías saw her and said nothing. He simply went to the room and came back with a skein of wool of the same color that he had saved without knowing why. That was the first gesture of respect anyone had ever given her without words. One day, a woman of about 50 arrived at the gate carrying a basket covered with cloth. Her name was Doña Lucrecia, a neighbor from the nearest ranch. She brought freshly laid eggs, a piece of goat cheese, and a jar of apple preserves she had made herself. She placed the basket in Rosario's arms and said, "If you need anything, you know where my ranch is." And she left without waiting for an answer. That evening, Rosario sat in the corridor with the jar between her hands, and for the first time since leaving Tirapatillo, she felt something that wasn't exactly relief, but resembled it. Something in her chest stopped hurting, just for a moment. The wooden box that held the photograph had been watching Rosario for weeks, every night before sleep. Dark, with a small brass lock that was open, Rosario hadn't touched it. It wasn't hers. But that night while Rosario slept, Don Isaías sat for a long time in the corridor with his hands folded on his knees, looking out into the darkness of the patio, thinking about what Bernardo had told him 3 months before he died, that if something happened to him, Isaías would know what to do, that Rosario would come, that she always found her way, even when she didn't know it yet. One afternoon of fine rain, Don Isaías came into the room carrying himself differently, as if he were holding something he had decided to let go of. He sat on the bench by the window. "That box has things in it that you need to see," he said. "It's not my place to tell you any other way. But 15 days ago, a notary from the town of Zacapu came looking for me. He told me there was a document registered 2 years ago that I needed to know about, and that the person who arrived would also need to know it when she arrived. Bernardo Villanueva was my nephew," said Don Isaías. "My sister's son. She died young. I raised him until he was 12. After that, he went to live with the Villanueva family in Tirapatillo because they had more. I never forgot him. He didn't forget me either." Rosario felt a chill rise up her spine. Don Isaías opened the box. Inside was a manila envelope with a notarial seal and a date written by hand, 2 years earlier. "Bernardo registered this before a notary in Zacapu. I signed as a witness because he asked me to. He never explained why he didn't tell you. Maybe he didn't know how. That's not for us to know now." But that night, as Rosario read the document by the light of an oil lamp, she would come to understand that Bernardo had done something the Villanueva family didn't know about, and that it changed everything. It was a certified partial will, signed by Bernardo Villanueva before the notary Agustin Ferreiro of Zacapu, with 2 registered witnesses. In it, Bernardo declared that the estate of Don Isaías Reyes was the legitimate property of his wife Rosario in the event of his death, with full rights of habitation and usufruct. The document included a clause that nullified any transfer of the Tirapatillo property carried out without the express consent of his wife. The notary had kept the copy. Don Isaías had the original, Rosario read the document 3 times, then she folded it carefully, placed it against her chest, and closed her eyes. "How long have you known?" she asked, without opening her eyes. "Since the notary came, 15 days ago, and you waited for me to arrive on my own." "Bernardo told me you would come," said Don Isaias from the doorway. "He said you always found your way." Rosario didn't answer. Outside, Canela moved slowly between the shadow and the lamplight. 2 weeks after reading the document, Consuelo Villanueva de Paredes and her eldest son arrived at the estate. They came in a truck that raised dust along the dirt road, with the faces of people who come to close a matter they believe is already settled. Don Isaias was sitting in his chair beside the door. He didn't stand up. Consuelo got out with a folder under her arm and said, without greeting, "We already know where you are. What you think you have is worth nothing. Bernardo had no rights over this property. We've come to clarify that. A woman alone can't manage an estate," her son added, looking at the patio with his mouth tight. "It would be better if she signed what needs to be signed and left before this gets complicated." Don Isaias stood up then. He was a thin man of 70, but he rose with his back straight and his eyes lifted, and when he spoke, he didn't need to raise his voice. "This property has been registered for 110 years in the Zacapu registry, under the name of the Reyes family. Bernardo Villanueva registered his rights over the inheritance that corresponded to him by direct lineage before a notary, and named his wife as beneficiary. That document is certified, it has 2 witnesses, and it predates by 2 years anything you may have signed in Tirapidio. The notary Ferrero can receive you tomorrow at 9 if you have questions." Consuelo opened her mouth. She closed it again. Her son looked at his mother. Consuelo looked at Rosario. Rosario looked at them calmly, with her hands folded over her now visible belly, with her feet firm on the dirt floor of the corridor, and said quietly, without anger, without haste, "I didn't come to inherit anything. I came to care for a man who had no one. And it turns out he also took care of me. There's nothing more to talk about here." Consuelo Villanueva pressed the folder against her chest. She looked around the patio, the apple trees, the corral, the whole estate, as if calculating whether it was worth the fight. Then she turned around and got into the truck. Her son followed without speaking. The dust they kicked up took a while to settle. Doña Lucrecia, who had arrived that day to bring tortillas and had been standing by the gate without anyone noticing, crossed herself slowly. That was all she said. Blood family sometimes falls apart when there's weight to carry. But loyalty remains, and in the end, it's the only thing that holds weight. By the time spring arrived at Don Isaias' estate, the apple trees had white blossoms on their branches, and the patio smelled of firewood and freshly baked bread. Rosario baked every other day in the clay mold she had found in the granary, with the recipe Doña Lucrecia had taught her one rainy morning. And the smell drifted out the open windows all the way to the road. The baby girl was born in March, before the frosts had ended. Don Isaias waited in the corridor all night, with a clay pot coffee in his hand, and when he heard the first cry, he came into the room, looked at the child, and said only, "Welcome." Then he went out and filled Canela's water trough with fresh water. The girl was named Bernarda, after the man who had never known how to say things on time, but who had done them all the same. The little oak box now sat at the center of the dining table, and on top of it Rosario had placed a framed photograph of a young Don Isaias beside his wife in the estate's patio. It was the place of honor. One Sunday in April, neighbors from various ranches along the road came, and they set up a long table beneath the apple trees, and there were beans from the pot, and fresh tortillas and hibiscus water, and Doña Lucrecia's apple preserves. The children ran among the blossoming trees, and Canela watched them from the gate with that calm of animals who have seen many things. Don Isaias sat next to Rosario at the end of the table, with the baby asleep in a basket at his feet, and said quietly, "Bernardo was right. You did find your way." Rosario looked at him. She smiled. "Just barely. God first, Don Isaias, and you, who left the gate open. Sometimes life pushes us toward a place we didn't ask for and didn't expect, and it turns out that place was the only one that truly belonged to us." Rosario Villanueva arrived at that estate with a light sack and her dignity intact, and she discovered that beneath the dust of years there was a truth no one had stolen from her, because no one had ever seen it. That's what they can't take from someone who knows how to carry weight without bending their back. Has an unexpected door ever opened for you when all the ones you knew had closed? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment below. Tell us what part of Mexico or where in the world you're watching from today. Subscribe to the Stories Between Lives channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that not all is lost when one door closes. Until the next story, a hug from heart to heart. I'm from where they loved me, Rosario told the little girl one night as she rocked her by the window facing the apple trees. And that place was always here,